The river moved like a snake in the dark. He could smell the wet earth, the wild sage. He could hear the wind whispering across the prairie like it was telling a secret older than any man. His name was Elias Cole, and he rode like the horizon was a promise that could never be kept. His face was a road map of hard miles, hidden under the brim of a worn-out hat. His heart was a quiet, scarred thing. He was a man made of silence. He might have just kept riding, let the darkness swallow him whole like it did every other night. But then he heard it. It wasn't a bird. It wasn't a coyote. It was a sound so thin it almost got lost in the river's current. A human sound. A sound of trouble. He pulled on the reins, his horse snorting, its ears twitching toward the riverbank. And that's when he saw them. Tangled in the reeds, like broken dolls someone had thrown away, were 3 young women. Their wrists were tied with thick, coarse rope. Their hair was matted with mud. Their eyes were wide with a fear so pure it was like a physical thing in the air. They weren't dead, but whoever left them here wanted them to be. The river was supposed to be their grave. He swung off his horse, his boots sinking into the soft mud. He moved slow, deliberate, like he was afraid a sudden move might shatter them. He knelt beside the eldest. Her eyes were sharp, full of fight, even though she was shaking. She glared at him, a cornered animal ready to bite, even with no strength left. He didn't say a word. He just pulled out his knife. The blade caught the last sliver of moonlight. He saw her flinch, but he just reached out and sliced through the rope on her wrists. She rubbed the raw skin, then immediately moved to shield the other 2 with her own body. A protector, even now. He understood that kind of fire. He used to have it himself. The second sister stirred. She whispered something in a language he didn't know, but he understood the meaning. She was alive. He cut her bonds, and she grabbed her sister's hand like it was the only thing keeping her anchored to the world. The youngest one didn't move. She just watched him. Her eyes were dark pools, following his every move. He cut her ropes and then stepped back. Gave her space, his way of saying, "I'm not a threat." Her gaze stayed on him, as if she was trying to decide if he was a man or a ghost the river had coughed up. But then the quiet moment was shattered. From across the river, a sound drifted on the wind, the unmistakable sound of hoofbeats. And they were getting closer. The eldest sister went rigid, her body as tight as a bowstring. The other 2 huddled closer, their brief moment of relief gone, replaced by that raw, pure terror. Their eyes locked on him. The suspicion was gone. Now it was a plea. He didn't hesitate. He kicked dirt over the tiny flame he'd started, plunging them into near-total darkness. He pointed to the tall reeds, his movements calm, steady. He'd done this before. He'd led frightened people through the dark before. The hoofbeats grew louder, voices carried across the water, rough and cruel. They were looking for them, cursing that the river hadn't done its job fast enough. Elias pushed the sisters deeper into the reeds, the cold water soaking their clothes. His body, a solid wall between them and the hunters. The youngest, her name was Winona, she looked back just once. She saw the last ember of their fire wink out. Then she looked at him. And in that moment, she knew. This stranger didn't just cut their ropes. He had just tied his fate to theirs. And the night was far from over. The hunters passed. Their voices faded into the distance, but the fear lingered, cold and sharp. Elias led them away from the river, moving through the night with a confidence that spoke of years spent in the wild. He found a small, hidden canyon, a crack in the earth shielded by ancient rock. This would be their sanctuary. For now. For days, they lived in that small pocket of silence. The world was the canyon, the river a distant hum, the sky a shifting canvas of blue and black. Elias was a creature of habit. Up before the sun, his movements quiet, efficient. He wasn't a man who wasted motion or words. He taught them things, not by lecturing, but by doing. He showed them how to read the clouds for rain, how to set a snare that a rabbit wouldn't see, how to know from the call of a bird if a stranger was near. His lessons were quiet offerings, and they took them like precious gifts. The eldest, Ayoka, was the watcher. Her distrust of him slowly, day by day, melted away. She saw the way he'd leave the biggest piece of cooked fish for them. She saw how he'd turn his back to give them privacy when they bathed in the small stream that trickled through the canyon. He was a man of honor, and she was beginning to see it. The middle sister, Nokomi's, was the laughter. She'd tease him about his silence, calling him Old Stone Face. But her jokes weren't mean. They were her way of chipping away at the fortress he'd built around himself, her way of saying, "We see you." But it was Winona, the youngest, who saw him most clearly. She watched the small things, the way his rough, calloused hands could so carefully mend a leather strap on his saddle, the way he'd stand watch all night, his rifle resting in his lap, not sleeping until he was sure they were safe. She saw the deep weariness in his eyes, a loneliness that felt as old as the stones around them. So she started to talk. She gave him small pieces of her story, testing his silence. She told him about the men who came to their village, men with smiles that didn't reach their eyes, men who promised protection but brought only violence. They weren't just random raiders. They were looking for something specific. Elias listened. He never pushed, never interrupted. He just held her words, keeping them safe. One evening by the low fire, Winona picked up a spare piece of rope. Her fingers, nimble and sure, began to braid it. It was an old, comforting habit. Her sisters watched and smiled. But when she was finished, she didn't put it aside. She walked over to Elias and placed the small, braided rope in his hand. He looked at it, then at her. He saw something in her eyes. It wasn't just thanks. It was a question. It was a test. He closed his hand around the rope, his silence for once feeling like an answer, a promise. The piece was a fragile thing, and it was about to break. The next morning, Elias found tracks at the mouth of the canyon. Fresh tracks, heavy boots, shod horses. They had been found. The hunters were back, and this time they wouldn't be so easily fooled. He didn't have to say a word. The sisters saw it in his face. The calm was gone. The steel was back. He told them his plan, his voice low and steady. There was a trail high up on the canyon rim, a deer trail, forgotten by men. It was dangerous, but it was their only way out. They would leave under the cover of darkness. That night, the stars were cold and unforgiving. They moved through the whispering grass like ghosts, Elias in the lead, but the hunters were clever, or maybe just lucky. A shout echoed from behind them. They'd been spotted. Hoofbeats thundered, a drumbeat of doom. Elias pushed them faster, toward the river again. It was their only chance to break the trail. He got the sisters across a shallow part of the water, then turned back, his rifle in his hands. He was going to make a stand. A lone figure against the starlight, a man who had decided he was done running. Winona was halfway across the river when she stopped. Her sisters grabbed her, trying to pull her to safety, but she ripped her arm free. All her life, she had been taught to run, to hide. But something inside her snapped. She wasn't that girl anymore. She turned and ran back. Back through the cold water, her breath tearing from her lungs. She ran until she was standing beside him, her small frame trembling, but her eyes burning with a fire that matched his own. He looked down at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, and then, something else, recognition, like he knew she would come back, like a part of him had been waiting for her to. The hunters burst over the ridge. Gunshots exploded in the night, bright flashes of violence. Elias fired back, his aim steady, dropping one of them from his saddle. But there were too many. A bullet slammed into his shoulder, spinning him around. He stumbled back, and Winona caught him. She dragged him behind a cluster of rocks, her hands pressing against the hot, wet wound. Tears streamed down her face, but her voice was steady. "You are not alone," she whispered, her voice fierce. "Not anymore." The hunters' voices grew closer, their cruel laughter echoing in the canyon. Elias was hurt. They were trapped. It seemed like the end of the line. But then a new sound cut through the night. More hoofbeats, a lot of them, coming from the other direction. Fast. The hunters heard it too. They paused, confusion in their voices. Who else could be out here? Elias, gritting his teeth against the pain, managed a weak smile. "Looks like my friends are finally on time," he muttered. Suddenly the night erupted. A dozen riders swept down from the opposite ridge, rifles blazing. They weren't lawmen. They were hard-looking men, moving with brutal efficiency. The hunters, caught completely by surprise, were cut down in a hail of gunfire. The fight was over in less than a minute. A man dismounted and strode toward them. He was older, with a graying beard and cold, calculating eyes. He nodded at Elias. Cole, always finding trouble. Elias pushed himself up, leaning against the rock. "Took you long enough, Marcus." Marcus's eyes flickered to Winona and her sisters, huddled behind the rocks. "Got what you were looking for?" Elias nodded slowly. "I think so." Winona stared, her mind reeling. Friends? These weren't friends. They were killers, just like the men who had been chasing them. She looked from Marcus's cold face to Elias's, and a terrible thought began to form. Elias hadn't stumbled upon them by accident. He wasn't just a kind stranger. He had been looking for them. And these men, these were his people, which meant Elias Cole was one of them. A hunter, a monster, the kindness, the protection. It had all been a lie, a trap. Her heart, which had just started to trust him, shattered into a million pieces. She felt the small braided rope in her pocket, and it suddenly felt like a snake. Marcus's men were gathering the bodies, moving with a grim purpose. Elias pushed himself to his feet, the pain in his shoulder forgotten for a moment. He saw the look on Winona's face, the accusation, the betrayal. "It's not what you think," he said, his voice rough. "Isn't it?" Ayoka stepped forward, her voice dripping with venom. She had never fully trusted him, and now she knew why. "You're one of them. You led us right to your pack of wolves." "No," Elias insisted, taking a step toward them. Marcus put a hand on his chest, stopping him. "Easy, Cole," Marcus said, his voice low. "Don't want to scare the merchandise." Merchandise. The word hung in the air, colder than the river water. So that's what they were. Cargo, to be delivered somewhere, to someone. "You promised me they wouldn't be harmed," Elias growled, turning on Marcus. "Plans change," Marcus said with a shrug. "The boss wants them, and he wants the little trinket the girl is carrying. He's paying double for a live delivery, pouch included." He looked straight at Winona. "So, why don't you be a good girl and hand it over? Save us all a lot of trouble." Winona's hand flew to the small leather pouch hidden in her dress, the one her father had given her, the one he had died to protect, the men who had first attacked them. They had been looking for this. Now she knew why. It wasn't just a keepsake. It was something valuable, something powerful, and Elias had known about it all along. That's why he saved them. Not out of kindness, out of greed. "I don't have it," she lied, her voice shaking but defiant. Marcus sighed, a long, theatrical sigh. "Don't make this difficult. We can search you. We can take you apart piece by piece until we find it. It makes no difference to me. But my boss, he prefers his packages undamaged." Elias stepped between Marcus and the sisters. "You're not touching them." Marcus laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Are you forgetting who you work for, Cole? You're just a delivery boy. Now step aside." "I'm done taking orders from you," Elias said, his hand slowly moving toward the pistol on his hip. "Or from Croft. The name dropped like a stone. Croft, Silas Croft, the vulture, the man who was buying up the whole territory, using blood and fear as his currency, the man who had driven her people from their lands, the man who had ordered her father's death. It all clicked into place. This was never about them. It was about the pouch. It was about what was inside. Marcus stopped laughing. His eyes narrowed. "You're making a big mistake, Elias." "My whole life's been a mistake," Elias shot back. "Working for him was the biggest. Tonight I start making it right." In that split second, the world exploded. Elias drew his pistol, but Marcus was faster. He didn't draw a gun. He grabbed Winona, pulling her in front of him as a shield, a knife pressed to her throat. "Drop it, Cole," Marcus snarled, "or the girl dies right here." Ayoka and Nokomis screamed. Elias froze, his face a mask of fury and despair. He had tried to fix things, but he had only made them worse. He had walked them from one cage straight into another. "See?" Marcus sneered, his foul breath on Winona's cheek. "You're not a hero, Elias. You're just a dog who forgot his leash. Now drop the gun. Slowly." Elias's eyes locked with Winona's. He saw her terror, but underneath it, he saw something else, the same fire he'd seen in her sister. She gave the slightest shake of her head. No, it was a choice. Her life, or the pouch. His life, or their freedom. In that frozen moment, the river roaring beside them, Elias knew there was no walking away from this. The debt he owed the world was coming due, right here, right now. He slowly lowered his gun, his heart pounding. "All right, Marcus, you win." Marcus grinned, a predator's smile. "I always do." He yanked Winona harder. Now, the pouch. Winona's mind was racing. The pouch contained a map to a hidden silver mine on her people's sacred land. And the deed, signed by the government years ago, proving their ownership. It was their last hope. The only thing that could stop a man like Silas Croft. If he got it, her people would lose everything forever. She couldn't give it to him. But the knife was cold against her skin. Then she saw it. Over Marcus's shoulder, she saw Elias's eyes flick upward, just for a second. He was looking at the crumbling canyon wall above them. It was a signal, a desperate, insane plan. She had to trust him. The man who had lied to her, the man who worked for her enemy. She had to trust the monster. "Okay," she whispered, her voice trembling. She reached into her dress, her fingers fumbling with the leather pouch. Her movements were deliberately slow, drawing Marcus's full attention. Elias saw his opening. It was barely a chance, a fool's hope, but it was all they had. He raised his pistol, not at Marcus, but at the rock formation high above him. He fired. The gunshot echoed like a thunderclap. The bullet slammed into the loose rock, sending a shower of pebbles down. For a second, nothing happened. Marcus laughed. "You missed, you idiot." But then came a deep, groaning sound. The shower of pebbles became a cascade of stones. A huge section of the canyon wall, weakened by years of rain and wind, began to shift. An avalanche of rock and dirt was about to come crashing down right on top of them. Marcus's eyes went wide with terror. His grip on Winona loosened for just a fraction of a second. It was enough. Winona stomped down hard on his foot and drove her elbow back into his gut. He grunted in pain, stumbling back as she twisted free. Elias was already moving, grabbing her and her sisters, pulling them away from the collapsing wall. The avalanche came down with a deafening roar, a tidal wave of stone that buried Marcus and his men. The ground shook, and the air filled with dust so thick they couldn't breathe. When the dust finally began to settle, there was only a mountain of rubble where the hunters had been. They were alive. They were free, but they were far from safe. They scrambled away from the rockfall, their ears ringing. Elias's shoulder was bleeding freely now, his face pale and slick with sweat. He stumbled, and Winona and Ayoka caught him, holding him up. The roles were reversed. Now they were saving him. "We have to go," he gasped. Croft will send more men, a lot more. They found their horses, which had scattered in the panic, and rode. They didn't look back. There was nothing to see but dust and death. They rode until the canyon was a distant memory, until the sun began to bleed across the eastern sky. They found shelter in a thick grove of cottonwood trees. While Nokomis kept watch, Winona and Ayoka tended to Elias's wound. He had lost a lot of blood. He was weak, drifting in and out of consciousness. Winona cleaned the wound as gently as she could. He had lied to them. He had been one of Croft's men, but he had also saved them. He had fired that shot, risking everything. He had chosen them over his own safety. The monster had a heart after all. "Why?" she asked him, her voice barely a whisper when his eyes fluttered open. "Why did you help us?" He looked at her, his gaze hazy with pain. "Croft, he sent me to get the pouch. Said your father had stolen it. He told me you were thieves, that I was just repossessing his property." He coughed, a racking sound. "But when I found you, tied up by the river, I saw what those men did, what I was a part of. I couldn't do it anymore." He had been a hunter, yes, sent to track them down, but seeing them, helpless and left for dead, had broken something in him. Or maybe it had fixed something that had been broken for a long time. "My father didn't steal it," Winona said, her voice fierce. "It belongs to our people. Croft is the thief." "I know that now," Elias rasped. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the braided rope she had given him, which was still clutched in her other hand. "I saw this. My mother. She used to make braids just like this. Before—" He trailed off, his eyes closing as the pain took him again. The pieces were starting to fit together, forming a picture that was more tragic than she could have imagined. Elias wasn't just a random gun for hire. His past was tangled up with theirs in ways she was just beginning to understand. Ayoka came over, her face grim. "He's fading. The bullet is still in there. If we don't get it out, he'll die." Winona looked at the man lying before her. He was their enemy and their savior, a monster and a victim. Her heart was a battlefield of confusion and a strange, terrifying new feeling, gratitude, and something more. She took a deep breath. "Then we'll get it out." She looked at her sister. "Heat the knife in the fire." The next few hours were a blur of pain and grit. With Ayoka holding him down and Nokomis ready with bandages, Winona probed the wound with the heated tip of Elias's knife. He cried out, a raw animal sound, but he didn't fight them. He trusted them. Even after everything, he trusted them. Finally, she found it. She pulled the misshapen piece of lead from his shoulder. They packed the wound with herbs Nokomis had found and bandaged it tightly. He was alive, but his fever was raging. His life was hanging by a thread. For 2 days, they stayed hidden in the grove, nursing him. They took turns watching him, feeding him sips of water, keeping his fever down with cool cloths. In his delirium, he spoke. He spoke of a family lost, of a life stolen. He spoke the name Croft, like a curse. Slowly, the fever broke. He woke up, clear-eyed for the first time in days. He saw them there, watching over him, his protectors. He tried to sit up, but Winona gently pushed him back down. "Rest," she said softly. "You need your strength." He looked at the 3 of them, these women he had been sent to capture, who had now saved his life. "He'll never stop," Elias said, his voice weak but clear. "Croft wants that map. He'll tear this whole territory apart to find it. You can't run far enough." "We know," Ayoka said, her arms crossed. "So we stop running." Elias looked at her, surprised by the steel in her voice. "This is our land," Winona added, her hand resting on the leather pouch. "Our home. We're not giving it up. We're going to fight." It was a crazy idea. 3 women and a wounded gunman against the most powerful, ruthless man in the territory. It was suicide. But as Elias looked at their determined faces, he knew they meant it. And he knew he couldn't let them do it alone. He had started this. He had to finish it. He had a debt to pay, not just to them, but to himself. "All right," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "If we're going to fight a monster, we're going to have to be clever. We're going to have to set a trap." He looked at Winona, "And I think I know the perfect bait." The plan was simple and completely insane. They wouldn't run from Croft. They would run to him. They would walk right into the lion's den. The town of Redemption was Croft's personal kingdom, bought and paid for with dirty money. The sheriff was on his payroll. The judge was in his pocket. It was the last place anyone would expect them to go. That was the first part of the trap. The second part was the bait. Winona took out the leather pouch. Inside, Elias carefully removed the sheepskin map and the deed. Using a piece of charcoal from the fire, he began to make a copy of the map on a spare piece of leather from his saddlebag. It was a good copy, good enough to fool someone who was looking for it. But he made one crucial change. The real map led to the silver mine through a series of hidden, defensible canyons. The fake map led to the same area, but through a wide-open, exposed valley. A kill box. "Croft won't come himself," Elias explained, his voice getting stronger each day. "He'll send his top man, a snake named Jebediah Kane. He was my partner once. He's smart, cunning, but he's also arrogant. He'll think he's walking into a trap he's already won." The plan was this. Nokomis, the fastest on a horse, would ride toward the next territory. She'd let herself be seen, making sure Croft's spies thought they were fleeing west. Meanwhile, Ayoka, a skilled hunter, would scout the valley, preparing rock slides and deadfalls. Elias and Winona would ride into Redemption. They would go to the saloon, Croft's headquarters, and demand a meeting. They would offer to sell him the map. Not the deed, just the map. It would look like a desperate move, a betrayal. Like Winona was selling out her own people to save her skin. It was a story Jebediah would believe. Once the deal was made, Jebediah would take the fake map and ride for the valley, expecting to find a fortune. Instead, he would find Ayoka, and Elias and Winona, who would have circled around, would be waiting for him. It was a long shot. 1,000 things could go wrong, but it was their only shot. Nokomis left at dawn, a brave smile on her face. "See you on the other side," she said, before kicking her horse into a gallop and disappearing over the horizon. Ayoka melted into the woods, a ghost with a rifle, on her way to prepare the Valley of Death. That left Elias and Winona. They rode toward Redemption, not as fugitives, but as players in a very dangerous game. Elias's arm was still in a sling, but the fire was back in his eyes. Winona felt a strange calm. Fear was a luxury she could no longer afford. They rode into Redemption at high noon. The town was dusty and tense. Men with guns on their hips watched them from every doorway. They looked at Elias with suspicion, and at Winona with a predatory gleam. They stopped in front of the grandest building in town, the Gilded Cage Saloon, Croft's throne room. Taking a deep breath, they pushed through the swinging doors. The saloon went quiet. Every eye turned to them. Card games stopped. The piano player's hands froze over the keys. At a back table, surrounded by his men, sat Jebediah Kane. He had a cruel face and eyes that were cold and empty. He looked at Elias, and a slow, ugly smile spread across his lips. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," Jebediah sneered. "Elias Cole, I heard you were dead." "Not yet," Elias said, his voice steady. He walked toward the table, Winona at his side. He was deliberately putting his wounded shoulder forward, making himself look weaker than he was. "And you brought the girl," Jebediah said, his eyes raking over Winona. "Saving us the trouble of hunting her down. How thoughtful." "We're not here to fight," Elias said. "We're here to make a deal." Jebediah laughed. "A deal? You're in no position to make a deal. You're a traitor, and she's a loose end. We're just going to take what we want and put you both in the ground." "You could," Elias conceded. "But you'll never find what you're really looking for." Winona stepped forward. She looked Jebediah right in the eye, her face a mask of cold fury. "You want the map to the silver mine? You can have it. For a price." Jebediah's smile faded. He leaned forward, interested now. "Go on." $5,000 in gold, she said, the number so high it made her dizzy. "And safe passage out of the territory, for both of us." One of the men at the table snorted. 5,000? That's insane." "The mine is worth 100 times that," Winona shot back, her voice not wavering. "And you'll never find it without this." She pulled the fake map from her dress and tossed it onto the table. Jebediah picked it up. He studied it for a long moment. He looked from the map to Winona, then to Elias. He was looking for the trick, the angle. He saw a wounded, desperate man and a frightened girl trying to sell out her heritage for a bag of gold. He saw greed and betrayal. It was a language he understood. "This is just the map," he said. "Where's the deed?" "The deed stays with me," Winona said. "It's my insurance. You get the map now. I get the deed when we're across the border and the gold is in our hands." It was a smart play. It made them look like they were thinking ahead, trying to protect themselves. It made the lie more believable. Jebediah finally nodded. "All right. You have a deal." He snapped his fingers. One of his men brought a heavy sack of coins and dropped it on the table. "You can count it if you want." "I trust you," Elias said, a lie so blatant it was almost the truth. "Get out of my town," Jebediah snarled. "I'll be right behind you. And if this map is a trick, there's no corner of this earth you can hide from me." They backed out of the saloon, the heavy bag of gold in Elias's good hand. They didn't run. They walked slowly to their horses, mounted up, and rode out of town, heading north. They could feel dozens of eyes on their backs. They rode for an hour, then 2. They knew Jebediah would give them a head start. He wanted them to feel safe. He was a cat playing with his food. Once they were deep in the rocky hills, Elias reined in his horse. "He'll follow our tracks. We have to split up." He handed Winona the real map and the deed. "You know the way from here. The canyons on this map. They'll keep you safe. Take the gold. Go find your sisters. Start a new life." She stared at him. "What about you?" "I'm going to lead him on a different path," Elias said. "Give you time to get away." He was going to circle back to the valley. He was going to face Jebediah alone. It was a suicide mission. "No," Winona said. "That wasn't the plan." "The plan changed," he said, echoing Marcus's cruel words, but his voice was gentle. "You've got what you need to win. The deed is your weapon. Don't throw it away for me." "You are not a distraction," she said, her voice shaking with anger and fear. "You are not a sacrifice. We do this together, or not at all." He looked at her, at the fierce loyalty in her eyes. The girl he'd found broken by the river was gone. In her place was a warrior, a queen. He had tried to save her, but somewhere along the way, she had saved him. He nodded slowly. "Together, then." They left the horses and the gold, climbing into the high rocks on foot. They moved fast, circling around toward the valley, where Jebediah Kane and his men were about to ride into their trap. The final battle was about to begin. The valley was quiet. Too quiet. Jebediah Kane and his 5 men rode in slowly, their eyes scanning the rocks. The fake map had led them here, but Jebediah was no fool. He could smell a trap. He held up a hand, and his men stopped. "Spread out," he ordered. "Find them." High above, hidden in a rocky crevice, Elias and Winona watched. Elias had his rifle ready. Ayoka was hidden somewhere across the valley. The trap was set. Now all they could do was wait. One of Jebediah's men dismounted and started climbing the rocks, heading straight for Ayoka's position. She had set a deadfall there, a massive, precariously balanced log. He was about to walk right under it, but he stopped. He looked up, his eyes narrowing. He'd seen something, a scuffed rock, a broken branch. He was too experienced. He wasn't falling for it. He yelled back to Jebediah, "It's a trap!" And all hell broke loose. Jebediah and his men opened fire, spraying the rocks with bullets. Elias fired back, his shot echoing through the valley. He saw one of the men go down, but they were still outnumbered, 4-3. Ayoka, her position revealed, had to act. She couldn't trigger the deadfall, so she did the next best thing. She shoved at the keystone, holding back a small rock slide she had prepared. It wasn't as big as the one that had buried Marcus, but it was enough. Rocks and dirt tumbled down the cliffside, forcing Jebediah's men to scatter, separating them. It was the opening they needed. Elias took aim at another man, but a bullet slammed into the rock next to his head, showering him with stone fragments. Jebediah had him pinned down. "Come on out, Elias!" Jebediah yelled, his voice bouncing off the canyon walls. "Let's finish this, just like old times." Winona knew she had to do something. She had the deed, the key to everything, tucked safely away. But the deed was useless if they were all dead. She looked around, desperate. She saw the horses. Jebediah's men had left them at the valley entrance. She had an idea, a terrible, risky idea. While Elias and Ayoka kept the gunmen busy, Winona scrambled down the backside of the ridge, silent as a shadow. She circled around, her heart pounding in her chest, until she came up behind the horses. She pulled out her knife, and with a few quick slashes, cut the reins. Then, with a loud yell, she slapped the lead horse on the rump. The horses panicked. They bolted, stampeding back the way they came, a wild, chaotic storm of hoof and hide. Jebediah's men, hearing the stampede, made a fatal mistake. They turned to look at their escaping getaway. In that moment of distraction, Elias and Ayoka fired. 2 more men fell. Now it was just Jebediah. He roared in frustration and rage, firing blindly up at the rocks. He knew he was beaten, but he wasn't going to go down without taking Elias with him. He scrambled up the rocks, climbing toward Elias's position with the speed and agility of a mountain cat. Elias tried to reload, but his wounded shoulder screamed in protest. He was too slow. Jebediah was on him, a knife in his hand. The 2 men crashed together, tumbling down the rocky slope, a tangle of limbs and fury. They were no longer gunmen. They were just 2 animals, fighting with their bare hands. Winona and Ayoka ran to help, but it was too late. The fight was too close, too brutal. They rolled to a stop at the bottom of the valley. Jebediah was on top, his knife raised, ready to strike the final blow. "I told you I'd put you in the ground," he snarled. But Elias had one last trick up his sleeve. With his good hand, he reached down and grabbed a handful of dust and sand. He threw it right in Jebediah's face. Jebediah howled, momentarily blinded. It was the only opening Elias needed. He twisted, grabbing the knife hand and turning it back on its owner. With a final, desperate shove, Elias drove the blade into Jebediah's chest. The man who had been his partner, his friend, looked down at the knife, a look of shock on his face. He looked at Elias, his eyes full of a strange, sad understanding. Then he collapsed. Silence fell over the valley. It was over. They had won. They found Nokomis a week later. She had led Croft's men on a wild goose chase, just as planned, before circling back. The reunion was a tearful, joyous thing. With the deed in hand, they rode not to a new life, but back to the old one. They went to the territorial governor. They showed him the deed. They told him the story of Silas Croft, of his land grabs, his killers, his reign of terror. The story, backed by the legal document, was undeniable. Croft's empire came crashing down. The law, finally forced to act, arrested him. His land was seized, his power broken. The valley and the silver mine were returned to Winona's people. Justice had been served. Elias stood with Winona on a ridge overlooking her village, which was slowly coming back to life. His arm was healed. The weariness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet peace. "What will you do now?" she asked. He looked out at the horizon. For the first time in his life, it didn't look like an endless, lonely road. It looked like a beginning. "I think," he said, turning to her, a small smile on his face, "I'm already home." He reached out and took her hand. Their fingers intertwined, a braid of two lives, once broken, now woven together. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of promise. They faced down a monster and found not just justice, but a future they never thought possible. It just goes to show you that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't buried in the ground, but are found in the courage of the people standing next to you. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for listening.